In the dark near the Rhine in March 1945, men worked over the ground with the care of stagehands before opening night. Shapes that should have weighed 30 tons lay flat and lifeless on the earth. A few soldiers bent close with air hoses and pumps. Slowly the forms rose, turrets took shape, gun barrels stiffened, rubber seams tightened in the cold night. From a distance, and from the right angle, an armored force was coming into being. These were not tanks. They were inflatable tanks, part of a deception built to be seen, heard, and believed. The men around them belonged to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a U.S. Army unit created for a strange assignment, to make the German army look in the wrong direction. By the spring of 1945, they had followed the Allied advance across Europe, from Normandy toward the Rhine, carrying with them a portable version of war. The performance had layers. Inflatable vehicles created the visual outline of strength. Loudspeakers could project the recorded sounds of armor and trucks moving through the night. Radio operators could imitate the traffic of units that were not really there. Soldiers provided the physical and security details that made the deception seem ordinary. Military police at crossroads, patches on shoulders, signs placed where passing eyes might notice them, camp habits staged just well enough to suggest a larger force nearby. At full effect, the unit could simulate roughly 2 divisions, around 30,000 men. In reality, it had only about 1,100 personnel. That imbalance was the point, and also the risk. Deception on this scale did not ask to be invisible. It asked to be convincing enough to attract attention. The 23rd was not trying to hide in the simple sense. It was trying to appear important. A careless unit might be ignored. A force that seemed too theatrical might be dismissed. The trick was to sit in the narrow space between doubt and certainty, giving enemy intelligence enough clues to assemble a false picture. The Germans did not need to see every tank. They only needed to receive a pattern: armor sounds on one road, radio traffic from a known formation, a glimpse of vehicles at daybreak, signs of guarded movement, the kind of military clutter that usually meant troops were massing. That is what made the work so dangerous. These soldiers were not merely creating scenery behind the lines. They were often placed where discovery, shell fire, patrols, and air attack were real possibilities. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed, and dozens were wounded during the unit's wartime service. The mission depended on controlled exposure. If the enemy believed the illusion, the fake army could become a real target. Near the Rhine, the stakes were especially high. The river was one of the last major barriers before the Allied armies moved deep into Germany. Real crossing sites mattered. Real divisions were preparing for real operations. To protect those movements, the Ghost Army's job in Operation Viersen, from March 18 to the 24th of March 1945, was to simulate the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions away from the 9th Army's actual Rhine crossing area. It was a performance designed not for applause, but for misdirection. Imagine the scene as a reconstruction, built only from the known methods of the unit. In darkness, men arranged dummy vehicles where reconnaissance might register them. They set the outline of a camp. They control what can be seen from roads and fields. Radio crews send the kind of traffic expected from divisions in the line. Sound crews prepare the rumble of engines, the clank and movement of units that exist elsewhere or not at all in that place. Every detail has to suggest presence without inviting close inspection. The men doing this were soldiers, but many were also artists, designers, technicians, and radio specialists. Their battlefield was perception. A badly placed inflatable tank could ruin the scene. A silent road where there should have been movement could raise questions. Radio procedure had to resemble the habits of actual formations. The deception worked only if many small signs agreed with one another. There was no guarantee the enemy would accept the picture. There was no certainty that a fake unit would draw attention away from the real one. Deception is never a machine that produces a clean result. It is an attempt to influence what another army notices, reports, and believes under pressure. But the 23rd had been built for that attempt, and by March 1945, it had carried out mission after mission in the moving, dangerous uncertainty of the European war. The tanks made of air were only the most visible part. Behind them stood an entire military theater company with guns, radios, loudspeakers, camouflage, security detachments, and the discipline to behave like something much larger than itself. The strange courage of the unit lay in the fact that its men wanted the enemy to notice them. If the illusion worked, German attention might shift away from the true blow. If it failed, the rubber tanks would not stop shrapnel, and the stage would become a battlefield. To understand why the U.S. Army created such a force, it is necessary to go back before the Rhine, before the unit's best-known deceptions, to a moment when the Allies were preparing for the invasion of Europe and needed more than firepower. They needed imagination turned into a weapon. Before a landing craft touched the beaches of Normandy, Allied planners faced a problem that could not be solved by ships and tanks alone. The invasion of Western Europe would require surprise, or at least uncertainty. German commanders had to wonder where the main blow would fall, how many Allied formations were available, and which signals from across the channel were real. Battlefield deception was not new. Armies had long used camouflage, false positions, dummy equipment, rumors, and misleading radio traffic. In the Second World War, the scale of modern intelligence made deception both more complicated and more valuable. Aircraft could photograph roads and camps, Radio intercepts could reveal movement. Prisoners, patrols, and local observation could add fragments to a larger picture. To mislead an enemy, it was no longer enough to hide a few guns under nets. The false story had to reach the enemy through several channels at once. The Allies gained experience with this kind of thinking before and during the Normandy campaign. Strategic deception helped shape German expectations about the invasion. But once armies were ashore and moving, the need changed. Commanders did not only need grand deception across nations and seas. They needed mobile, tactical deception that could travel with the front, appear in a new sector, impersonate strength, then pack up and move again. Into that problem came a set of ideas associated with men who understood both the army and the power of appearances. Ralph Ingersoll, a writer and officer, helped press the case for a specialized deception unit. Billy Harris, connected with camouflage and theatrical deception work, was also part of the development of the concept. Colonel Harry Reeder became the commander of the force that would carry it out in the field. Their names belong to the story not because one man invented deception, but because the U.S. Army was shaping scattered techniques into a mobile instrument. The concept was bold in practical terms. Instead of leaving deception entirely to local improvisation, the Army would create a dedicated unit capable of imitating large formations. It would carry its own visual equipment, sound capability, radio specialists, and security support. It could arrive in a sector and, within limits, make itself look and sound like divisions that were somewhere else, or formations whose apparent presence would help confuse the enemy's picture. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was activated on the 20th of January 1944. Its authorized strength was 82 officers and 1,023 enlisted men. In military numbers, it was small. In the deception plan, it was immense. Roughly 1,100 men were expected to simulate about 2 divisions, around 30,000 troops. That assignment required a different definition of strength. A normal unit multiplied power with weapons and manpower. This one multiplied signals. Its 4 main capabilities were visual deception, sonic deception, spoof radio, and physical and security support. Each filled a different gap in the illusion. Visual deception included dummy tanks, artillery, trucks, and other equipment that could create the outline of a military force. Sonic deception used powerful speakers to project carefully prepared sounds of movement. Spoof radio created traffic that suggested the presence of real formations. Physical and security support made the story believable on the ground. Traffic control, guard posts, signs, and the normal texture of an army at work. None of these elements was sufficient alone. A field full of dummy tanks without radio traffic might look suspicious. Radio chatter without visible evidence might be discounted. Sound without security and movement might seem like noise. The ambition of the 23rd was combined deception, the weaving together of partial truths, visible clues, and staged military behavior until the false formation felt plausible. The first mission to combine visual, sonic, and radio deception was Operation Breast. It showed the promise of the method, but it also exposed coordination risks. A deception unit had to synchronize with real operations, real headquarters, and real movements nearby. If one part of the story moved ahead of another, or if local units did not understand the plan, the false picture could fray. The Ghost Army's work depended on timing, discipline, and cooperation in a battlefield where plans often changed quickly. That lesson would follow the unit across Europe. The 23rd conducted 22 large-scale deceptions from Normandy to the Rhine. Some missions supported offensive movement. Some helped cover weak points. Operation Bettenberg, from September 15 to 22, 1,944, covered a dangerous gap in Patton's line for more than a week. During the Battle of the Bulge, Operation Kodak used radio deception alone to divert attention from the effort to relieve Bastogne. The unit's tools could be combined or separated depending on the mission. But at its core, the assignment remained the same. Create a military fact that was not physically true, and make the enemy treat it as if it might be. That required soldiers who could think like engineers, actors, artists, radio operators, and guards all at once. The Army had built the frame. Now it needed the men who could make illusions survive contact with war. A soldier sketching a road junction can be doing more than making a picture. In a deception unit, he may be studying how a passing observer reads the world, where the eye goes first, what looks natural, what seems out of place, a line of vehicles, a shadow under a net, a sign near a crossroads, a patch on a uniform, the rhythm of traffic on a radio channel. Each small thing can become evidence. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops needed men who could handle that evidence. It drew on soldiers with conventional military skills, but also on artists, designers, engineers, radio operators, sound technicians, draftsmen, and craftsmen. Their job was not simply to build props. It was to create a believable military environment under field conditions, often close enough to danger that the illusion could draw fire. Some members later became widely known in civilian life. Ellsworth Kelly would become an important American artist. Bill Blass would become a major fashion designer. Art Kane would become a noted photographer. In the wartime unit, names like these were not celebrities on a roster. They were examples of the unusual talent pool gathered for a military task that rewarded a trained eye, a feel for form, and an understanding of how appearances persuade. The work demanded observation first. A dummy tank was not useful merely because it resembled a tank in isolation. It had to fit into a scene. It had to sit where a real crew might place it, not where a display designer would center it. Tracks, spacing, concealment, and surrounding activity all mattered. The goal was not perfection at arm's length. The goal was plausibility at the distances and angles from which enemy reconnaissance might gather information. That distinction shaped the craft. Inflatable vehicles were light compared with the machines they represented, but they needed careful handling. If they sagged, twisted, or appeared in impossible patterns, they could betray themselves. Camouflage had to conceal and reveal at the same time. Too much concealment might suggest there was nothing worth hiding. Too little could invite close scrutiny. The soldiers had to understand the visual grammar of an army in the field. Performance mattered just as much. Men wore the shoulder patches of units they were impersonating when the mission required that kind of signal. Military police and security details could create the impression of busy headquarters or restricted zones. Movement along roads could suggest the presence of formations beyond what was actually there. These actions were not theater in the harmless sense. They were military behavior staged for hostile observation. The radio operators carried a different burden. Spoof radio depended on procedure, rhythm, and credibility. A radio network has habits: how messages are passed, how operators sound in their timing, how a unit's communications pattern rises and falls with activity. The 23rd's radio work had to suggest formations that were not in that place. It was not enough to transmit noise. It had to resemble an army speaking to itself. Sound crews added another layer. Sonic deception used loudspeakers to project the recorded or prepared sounds of military movement. Used with visual and radio measures, those sounds could help complete the picture of armor, trucks, and troops on the move. But sound is tricky. It carries differently with weather, terrain, and distance. Too faint, and it means little. Too obvious, and it may feel artificial. The men using it had to turn machinery, landscape, and night air into part of the operation. Engineers and technicians kept the whole apparatus functioning. Inflatable equipment, generators, speakers, vehicles, radios, and field gear all had to move with the unit. A deception force that arrived late or broke down at the wrong moment could not simply apologize and try again. It was supporting real combat plans. Its false presence had to align with real deadlines. Still, the 23rd was not a group of artists playing soldier. It was a military unit in a war zone. Its members trained and operated under Army command. They worked around real artillery, real mines, real roads, real confusion, and real casualties. 3 of its soldiers were killed, and dozens were wounded over the course of its service. The illusion was fragile, but the danger surrounding it was not. What made the unit unusual was the way it expanded the meaning of soldiering. In most combat formations, survival depended on firepower, movement, discipline, and endurance. In the Ghost Army, those still mattered, but so did composition, timing, imitation, and restraint. The men had to know what not to show. They had to leave clues without leaving proof. They had to make absence look like mass. After the war's combat mission ended, members of the unit helped manage displaced person camps holding up to 100,000 people, a reminder that their service did not end neatly when deception operations stopped. For decades, much of the story remained classified, with official details declassified in the mid-1990s. In March 2024, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and the 3,133rd Signal Service Company Special received the Congressional Gold Medal. But before recognition, before the files opened, and the strange achievement could be widely understood, there was the work itself. A small unit moving through Europe with rubber armor, loudspeakers, radios, and a dangerous talent for being seen. Their next test would show both the power of that invention and the hazards of trying to coordinate a lie in the middle of a real war. At Camp Forest, Tennessee, the trick began in ordinary Army fashion. Men in uniform, orders on paper, equipment lists, inspections, schedules, and drills. Nothing about the pine woods and training grounds announced that this was a school for battlefield illusion. Yet that was what the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had to become. Activated on the 20th of January 1944, with an authorized strength of 82 officers and 1,023 enlisted men, the unit was being shaped for a kind of combat that depended on making the enemy misread what was in front of him. The problem was not simply how to hide something. Armies had used camouflage for generations. The harder problem was how to create something that was not there, then make it convincing from more than one direction. A false tank park might look persuasive from a road or an aircraft, but if radio traffic did not match it, if sound did not match it, if military police at a checkpoint did not speak as if a real division was nearby, the picture could break. Deception was not a single prop. It was a story told in fragments. At Camp Forest, the unit trained around the 4 capabilities that would define it in Europe: visual deception, sonic deception, spoof radio, and physical and security support. Each had its own craft. The visual men had to think like set builders, camouflage specialists, and soldiers at the same time. Radio operators had to imitate the habits of real units without giving away the fact that they were imitating. The men responsible for security and physical detail had to make the fake formation fit into the living traffic of an army on the move. Signs, patches, vehicle markings, roadblocks, and rumors all had to point in the same direction. The sonic work reached beyond Camp Forest. At Pine Camp in New York, the sound side of the deception took on a more technical form. The aim was not to make random battlefield noise. It was to reproduce the recognizable sound of military activity: engines starting, vehicles grinding along roads, troops moving, bridges being built. Bell Labs sound technology helped make that possible. Recordings could be selected, mixed, and projected in ways that suggested a large force operating beyond sight. In a war where commanders listened as well as looked, sound could become evidence. The Americans were not inventing deception from nothing. British experience influenced the development of these methods. Earlier in the war, deception had already shown that enemy expectations could be shaped by careful signals, visible clues, and controlled patterns. The 23rd took those lessons into its own organization and gave them an American field form. It was not enough to own inflatable equipment, speakers, and radios. The unit had to learn how to make them serve one plan. That plan always began with a false identity. The Ghost Army might be ordered to appear as a larger formation, often creating the impression of roughly 2 divisions, around 30,000 men. In reality, it had only about 1,100 personnel. The gap between those numbers was the space where the illusion lived. To fill it, every visible and invisible detail had to support the same false story. If the pretend force was supposed to be moving into an area, radio traffic had to suggest movement. Vehicles had to be seen where vehicles would logically appear. Sounds had to arrive at believable hours. Headquarters signs had to be placed with care. The human behavior around the deception had to feel routine, because routine is often what makes military information seem real. The training demanded restraint. A bad deception could be too dramatic. Too many clues in the wrong place might call attention to themselves. Too little activity might fail to register at all. The men had to learn the balance between visibility and exposure. They were not trying to fool an audience seated in front of a stage. They were trying to affect observation through aircraft, patrols, distant listening posts, captured messages, road traffic, and whatever scraps of information moved through a battle area. There were also coordination risks from the beginning. A sonic display that did not match the radio script could weaken the entire effort. A visual layout that suggested one kind of unit while radio traffic suggested another could create contradiction instead of belief. A checkpoint soldier wearing the wrong insignia, a vehicle moving like it belonged to a small detachment rather than a larger formation, or a silent road where an active division should have been noisy could all become problems. Deception was a chain, and any weak link could make the whole construction suspect. This was why the training had to turn artists, radio men, engineers, drivers, and security personnel into parts of one instrument. The value of the unit did not rest on a single ingenious device. It rested on synchronization. In Europe, the 23rd would conduct 22 large-scale deceptions from Normandy to the Rhine. Some would combine all of its major tools. Others would rely on only one. But the basic rule remained the same. The lie had to be complete enough to survive contact with a real battlefield. By the time the unit moved toward war, it had learned that deception was not make-believe in the simple sense. It was disciplined construction under pressure. It required plans, rehearsals, technical skill, and a constant awareness that the fake army would operate beside real units facing real danger. The next layer of that construction was the one most people could picture first: the visible army, made from rubber, canvas, camouflage, shadows, and distance. Imagine a tank sitting in a field at the edge of a European road. From a distance, under the right light, it has the shape of armored power: turret, gun, hull, shadow. A passing aircraft might register it quickly. A distant observer might mark it as part of a larger formation. But up close, the truth could be startlingly thin. Some of the Ghost Army's armor was inflatable, designed not to fight but to be noticed. The visual stage was the most theatrical part of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, and also one of the most unforgiving. Inflatable tanks, artillery pieces, aircraft, and other dummy equipment gave the unit a way to create mass without mass. These objects could suggest the presence of formations far larger than the men actually on the ground. Around them, camouflage helped break outlines or hide supporting details. Fake headquarters could be arranged to imply command activity. Signs, tents, vehicle markings, and guarded areas could make a location appear occupied by a major unit rather than by a small deception force. But the visual work was never just a matter of placing rubber equipment in a field. A battlefield was not a museum display. Roads were used, dust moved, aircraft passed overhead. Local terrain shaped what could be seen and from where. The men had to consider how a scene would look from a hillside, from a road junction, from the air, or through uncertain weather. They had to build for the observer they expected, not for an imaginary viewer with perfect access. Artists in the unit brought valuable instincts to this work. Many understood distance, light, shadow, composition, and perspective. A dummy tank did not have to fool someone standing close enough to touch it. It had to fool the kind of observation the operation anticipated. At several hundred yards, a convincing silhouette could matter more than fine detail. Under low light, a shape placed against the right background could carry more weight than its material. From above, spacing and pattern could suggest military order. From the ground, partial concealment could let the viewer complete the image in his own mind. That was the strength of the visual deception. It used the observer's expectations. Armies look for patterns. A headquarters tends to have a certain kind of traffic around it. Artillery positions have certain arrangements. Vehicle parks, bivouacs, supply areas, and command posts leave recognizable traces. The Ghost Army used those traces as visual language. A few real vehicles, a cluster of dummy equipment, the right markings, and a guarded road could begin to say, without words, that a larger force had arrived. Yet every prop introduced risk. Inflatable equipment had practical weaknesses. Wind could shift or damage it. A close observer could see too much. Footprints, tire marks, and vehicle behavior could betray the scale of the actual force. A real armored formation leaves heavy, repeated signs of movement. A deception unit had to think about the ground as carefully as the object placed on it. If the scene showed rows of tanks but the road did not show the expected activity, the picture could become less convincing. If vehicles moved too lightly, too rarely, or in ways that did not fit the unit being portrayed, the lie could fray. The men also had to worry about what not to show. Too perfect a layout could be suspicious. Real military areas are often messy, improvised, and shaped by terrain. A convincing fake headquarters needed enough order to be readable, but enough ordinary disorder to feel lived in. Camouflage had to conceal and reveal at the same time. If everything was hidden, there was no deception to observe. If everything was exposed, the observer might see the weakness of the display. This made visual deception a kind of controlled invitation. The Ghost Army wanted selected clues to be visible: a shoulder patch glimpsed at the right moment, a sign at a crossroads, a tank shape partly concealed in an orchard, a few trucks moving through a village, a headquarters area with the right appearance. Each clue could support the larger fiction. None had to carry the whole burden alone. Together, they could help a small unit seem like a much larger one. The work demanded constant maintenance. Inflatable equipment had to stay inflated. Camouflage had to be adjusted. Weather could change the look of a position. Mud, dust, and tracks could either help or hurt the illusion. Light shifted through the day, turning a convincing object into an exposed one, or hiding a flaw that would have been obvious earlier. The visual men had to keep looking at their own deception from the outside, asking how it would appear to someone who did not know the trick. There was danger in that exposure. To be useful, the fake army often had to place itself where it could be detected. The men were not safely behind a curtain. They operated on real roads and in real war zones, near the same hazards that threatened other soldiers. The fact that much of their equipment was fake did not make the artillery, mines, confusion, and movement around them fake. The visual stage gave the Ghost Army its most memorable image: rubber tanks standing in for steel ones. But the eye was only one path into the enemy's understanding. A silent army, no matter how carefully arranged, could feel incomplete. To make the illusion breathe at night and beyond the horizon, the 23rd needed another layer, one that could roll through the darkness without a single tank moving at all. At night, an army can announce itself before it is seen. Engines cough to life, tracks grind against road surfaces. Trucks shift gears, men move equipment. Somewhere in the dark, a bridge seems to be going up, or a column seems to be passing through. For the Ghost Army, those sounds could be manufactured, timed, and aimed. Sonic deception turned military noise into a weapon of suggestion. The goal was not random loudness, it was recognizable activity. Recordings could represent engines, bridge building, troop movement, and other sounds associated with large formations on the move or preparing for action. When matched to the visual and radio story, these sounds gave the fake army a presence beyond the limits of sight. A field full of dummy tanks became more plausible if, after dark, the area also seemed to rumble with the machinery of a real unit. The technology was substantial for a mobile deception force. The sonic equipment included powerful speaker systems mounted on half-tracks. Some of the equipment weighed around 500 pounds, a reminder that this was not a simple matter of carrying a loudspeaker into a field. Under good conditions, the projected sound could carry up to about 15 miles. That range gave the unit a way to place imaginary movement in the minds of listeners who might never see the source. But sound is never fully obedient. Weather, terrain, and timing turned sonic deception into a technical operation. Wind could help carry noise or push it away. Hills, forests, buildings, and valleys could shape what was heard and what disappeared. Moisture and temperature could affect how sound traveled. A recording that seemed convincing in one place might fail in another if the ground and air did not cooperate. The men had to think not only about what sound to play, but where to play it, when to begin, how long to continue, and what the surrounding world would do to it. The timing mattered because armies have rhythms. A unit moving into position does not sound the same at noon as it does in the small hours before dawn. Bridge construction has a different meaning depending on where it is heard and what operations are believed to be possible nearby. Engines massing at night could imply preparation. Traffic sounds along a route could suggest a shift of strength. The Ghost Army had to use sound in ways that fit the false story already being told by radios, signs, visible equipment, and human behavior. That coordination was the heart of the method. If radio traffic suggested that a division was arriving, sonic deception might help give that arrival weight. If dummy vehicles had been placed where a larger force was supposed to gather, engine sounds could make the scene feel active. If a fake headquarters was meant to represent a functioning command, the surrounding noise had to support the idea of a living formation rather than a quiet display. The recordings themselves were part of a broader technical achievement shaped by wartime experimentation and Bell Labs sound technology. The sounds had to be selected and reproduced clearly enough to be recognizable at distance, yet not so artificially presented that they drew attention to the mechanism behind them. The men using the equipment were not simply pressing play. They were conducting an acoustic performance in terrain they did not control. There were limits. Poor conditions could reduce range or distort the effect. A badly chosen position might send sound in the wrong direction. A schedule that failed to match expected military behavior could weaken the deception. And because sonic work often had to be close enough to matter, it placed men and vehicles within reach of the dangers of the combat zone. The equipment was fake only in what it represented. The operation itself was real, heavy, and exposed. Sonic deception also depended on what the listener already believed or suspected. Sound alone might not prove that a large force was present, but sound combined with radio chatter, visible markings, dummy armor, traffic control, and the rumor of movement could become persuasive. A listener did not need to identify every engine or every vehicle. The impression was cumulative. Something large is there, or something large is moving. This was why the Ghost Army's separate crafts could not remain separate in practice. Visual deception made the body, radio gave it a nervous system, sonic deception gave it breath and motion. Security and physical details gave it contact with the real world. When all four worked together, roughly 1,100 men could simulate something closer to 2 divisions, around 30,000 men. The illusion did not erase risk, and it did not guarantee success. It gave commanders another instrument in a war where movement, uncertainty, and misdirection could matter as much as strength. The first major test of combining these elements would come at Brest. There the unit would attempt to weave visual, sonic, and radio deception into one operation. It would also discover how difficult it was to keep every part of a false army moving in step while the real war pressed in around it. A radio operator could sit in a darkened room, tap a key with 2 fingers, and leave behind a signature as personal as handwriting. In Morse code, speed mattered, spacing mattered. Pressure, rhythm, hesitation, the tiny habits between letters, all of it could become recognizable to another trained operator. Soldiers called that sending style a fist. For the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the fist was not a small technical detail. It was one of the locks on the door. If a real division pulled out of one sector but its familiar radio traffic seemed to remain behind, the illusion had a chance. If the wrong rhythm appeared on the air, or the traffic sounded too neat, too empty, or too artificial, the deception could begin to fray. Spoof radio was one of the unit's 4 main capabilities, alongside visual deception, sonic deception, and the physical and security work that made the false picture feel solid on the ground. The radio men did not simply transmit noise. They built imitations of military networks. They studied how real units communicated, then recreated the patterns when those units moved somewhere else. Call signs, message volume, timing, and operator habits all helped suggest that a formation was still in place, or that it had arrived where the deception plan wanted it to appear. This work required restraint. A real army does not speak constantly just to prove it exists. It has routines, delays, mistakes, quiet periods, bursts of administrative traffic, and the ordinary pulse of units trying to function. To imitate that convincingly, the Ghost Army's radio operators had to make absence sound normal and presence sound routine. Their transmissions supported the larger deception by giving an invisible army an invisible nervous system. A field full of inflatable tanks could catch a distant eye. Loudspeakers could suggest the movement of men and vehicles. But radio made the fiction travel. It could reach listeners who never saw a dummy gun, never heard a half-track recording, never crossed a road guarded by military police wearing another unit's shoulder patch. Radio gave scale to the performance. It suggested headquarters, subordinate units, supply channels, and the everyday business of command. The men operating those sets were part technicians, part actors, and part copyists. Their craft depended on disciplined imitation, not theatrical flourish. They were not inventing a fantasy army from nothing. They were borrowing the habits of real units and allowing those habits to linger in the wrong place at the right time. While actual formations shifted to new positions, spoof networks helped leave a shadow behind them, or help project that shadow somewhere else. The danger was that radio alone could never carry the whole illusion. A unit that talked on the air but left no footprint on the roads might invite suspicion. So the radio deception had to match what could be seen and heard nearby. If the airwaves suggested a division headquarters, then the ground needed signs of that headquarters. If traffic implied movement, roads had to show movement. If shoulder patches pointed to a particular unit, the radio net could not contradict them. This is where the Ghost Army's impersonation became physical. Men wore patches from units they were pretending to represent. Signs appeared where signs should appear. Vehicles carried markings that fit the story. Laundry could be hung out with the right insignia visible. Military police and security personnel could guide traffic and project the routine authority of a formation that was not truly there in the expected strength. These details were not decoration. They were the friction that made the deception touchable. Rumor also had its place, but it had to be handled with care. Soldiers passing through a town, local civilians watching traffic on a road, and enemy intelligence trying to assemble scraps of information could all become part of the wider battlefield picture. The 23rd's physical and security support helped manage what that picture looked like. A false patch seen at a checkpoint, A marked truck parked in view, a plausible pattern of radio traffic, and the sound of vehicles at night could reinforce one another until the false order of battle seemed to have weight. No single element had to convince everyone by itself. The point was accumulation. A listener might hear a familiar fist. An observer might see a divisional sign. Someone else might report tanks or troop movement. Another channel might detect the normal chatter of a headquarters. If those fragments aligned, they could suggest a force far larger than the roughly 1,100 personnel actually present. The authorized strength of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was 82 officers and 1,023 enlisted men. On paper, that was a small command compared with the formations it imitated. In practice, the unit could simulate roughly 2 divisions, around 30,000 men, by combining its methods and by exploiting the enemy's need to interpret incomplete information. That was the essence of its power. It did not need to become the army it portrayed. It needed others to accept the possibility long enough for real commanders to act. Yet every imitation created obligations. A false radio network had to match a false visual presence. A false visual presence had to fit the roads, the sounds, the security posts, and the story of the front. If one part moved too early or too late, it could weaken the whole construction. The Ghost Army could create a convincing mask, but the mask had to be tied to real operations, real schedules, and real risk. That truth became clearer once the unit crossed into the European War. The craft of sending a borrowed fist over the air was only one part of the challenge. Soon, those signals, patches, signs, and rumors would have to function in Normandy's dangerous, crowded battle space, where a false move could collide with the real army it was meant to protect. The Channel crossing did not carry the Ghost Army into a stage set. It carried them toward roads jammed with military traffic, fields scarred by recent fighting, and a front that was still close enough to punish mistakes. After D-Day, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops moved from Britain into France and began learning what deception meant when the war was no longer theoretical. The unit had been activated on the 20th of January 1944. Its authorized strength was 82 officers and 1,023 enlisted men, a compact formation designed to create the appearance of something much larger. In Britain, its separate talents could be organized, rehearsed, and prepared. Visual deception units could work with dummy equipment and camouflage. Sonic teams could ready their recordings and loudspeakers. Radio specialists could study the habits of real networks. Security and physical support could learn how to make the illusion visible in small, practical ways. France changed the conditions. After the Allied landings in Normandy, movement across the Channel placed the unit inside an active campaign, close to real combat units and real consequences. The deception force did not operate outside the war. It operated inside the same weather, road systems, command pressures, and dangers as everyone else moving across the lodgment. Early Normandy assignments forced the men to treat every performance as part of a live battlefield. A dummy position could not simply look convincing from one angle. It had to fit the terrain and the operational story. A spoof radio net could not chatter independently of what real units were doing. A sign or shoulder patch could not be chosen casually. The deception had to harmonize with the movement of actual formations, or it risked confusing the wrong people. That was one of the hardest lessons. Deception was not magic laid over war after the fact. It had to be coordinated with real operations from the beginning. If a real division moved, the false signals associated with it had to be timed. If commanders wanted the enemy to look toward one place, the deception had to be strong enough and coherent enough to encourage that attention without interfering with friendly plans. If security forces sent traffic down a road, the markings and behavior on that road had to support the larger story. The danger of operating close to the front was also immediate. The Ghost Army's equipment might include inflatable tanks, dummy guns, loudspeakers, and fabricated signs, but the men handling them were real soldiers in a real theater. Their work could bring them into areas exposed to artillery, air attack, accidents, mines, and the ordinary hazards of a moving army. Across the 23rd's combat service, 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed and dozens were wounded. The deception was artificial in appearance, but it was not safe or bloodless. In Normandy, closeness to the front created another problem. The unit had to be visible enough to be noticed, but not so exposed that the illusion collapsed under inspection or fire. It had to suggest mass without actually possessing mass. Roughly 1,100 personnel could simulate something like 2 divisions, around 30,000 men, only if they carefully selected what to show, what to hide, and when to transmit, move, or make noise. The same road might carry real troops one day and deception traffic the next. The same village might see genuine military police, then men wearing the patches of a unit they were portraying. A field that seemed to contain armor might hold inflatable shapes. A radio net that appeared to belong to a formation might be operated by men trained to imitate its habits. None of these pieces worked in isolation. The landscape itself became part of the instrument. This required commanders to understand what the 23rd could and could not do. The unit could create the appearance of strength. It could leave a false trail. It could suggest that a formation was in one area while the actual soldiers moved elsewhere. It could support a broader plan by shaping what hostile intelligence might see, hear, or intercept. But it could not replace real combat power. It could not hold ground the way an infantry division could hold it. It could not guarantee what the enemy would believe. The best deception offered probability, not certainty. It increased the chance that scattered clues would be read in the desired way. It complicated an enemy's picture. It could buy time, cover a movement, or draw attention from a vulnerable point. But every such effort depended on the discipline of many separate commands. If a real unit moved unexpectedly through the wrong deception area, or if markings and radio traffic contradicted one another, the false picture could become confused. Normandy was therefore a school in coordination. The Ghost Army had to learn how to plug itself into real plans without disrupting them. It had to become convincing to enemy observers while remaining understandable to friendly commanders. It had to move as a specialized instrument, not as a traveling theater troupe detached from battle. Those early operations helped shape the unit's later work across Europe. From Normandy toward the Rhine, the 23rd would conduct 22 large-scale deceptions. Some would use multiple capabilities together. Others would emphasize one craft, such as radio. All of them rested on the same principle being tested in France. The false army had to be synchronized with the real one. The next major test would come at a port city built for defense and bitterly contested. At Brest, the Ghost Army would attempt its first mission combining visual, sonic, and radio deception. It would also learn that directing attention is dangerous when the real battlefield does not move exactly as planned. At Brest, the war narrowed around a fortified port. The city had strategic value, but by the time the Ghost Army became involved, it was also a hard, dangerous problem on the western edge of France. The fighting there placed deception beside siege warfare, fixed defenses, and the pressure to make a false force seem useful in a very real battle. Operation Brest became the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops' first mission, combining visual, sonic, and radio deception. That made it a turning point. Earlier work had tested pieces of the craft. Brest required the unit to weave those pieces together into one coordinated story, with dummy equipment, sound effects, radio traffic, and physical details all pointing in the same general direction. The basic idea was not to win the fight with canvas, rubber, loudspeakers, and Morse code. The Ghost Army could not do that. Its value lay in shaping perception. If the false indicators suggested the presence or movement of significant American strength, they might influence how attention was distributed around the battlefield. As always, the result could not be guaranteed. Deception worked in uncertainty, using fragments that might be collected, interpreted, doubted, or ignored. The visual side gave the operation a body. Dummy vehicles and positions could create the outward signs of troops and equipment where planners wanted them seen. Marks, signs, controlled movement, and the ordinary clutter of military life helped make the display less abstract. An observer who saw only a perfect row of dummies might doubt it. An observer who saw the surrounding details of a unit in the field might have more to consider. The sonic side gave that body motion. Recordings and loudspeakers could suggest the movement of vehicles and men, especially when used at night or from carefully chosen positions. Sound could deepen the impression that a formation was arriving, shifting, or preparing. But sonic deception was vulnerable to poor timing. Played in the wrong place or disconnected from visible and radio evidence, it could become noise instead of proof. Radio gave the false picture command structure. Spoof operators imitated the communications of real units, using call signs, message patterns, and operator habits to suggest that the expected military network existed where the deception plan placed it. The radio work did not have to explain the whole story. It had to fit the rest of the story and make the supposed force feel operational. At Brest, combining these elements increased the possible effect, but it also increased the number of ways the deception could go wrong. A visual display had to match the radio traffic. Radio timing had to match physical movement. Sound had to support both. Friendly units had to know enough about the deception to avoid disrupting it, but not so broadly or carelessly that security suffered. Coordination was not a technical luxury. It was the foundation. The lesson became clear in a miscommunication involving a real tank company. In the confusion of the operation, the presence or movement of actual armor interacted with the deception effort in a way that exposed the risk of mixing real and false forces without tight control. The important point is not a dramatic tale of discovery or a proven enemy response. The point is operational. If a commander is trying to direct attention toward a particular picture, then every real asset entering that picture changes it. A real tank company could make a deception more convincing if its role was understood and integrated. It could also confuse the plan if it appeared where the false story did not require it, or if its movement conflicted with the signals being sent by radio, sound, and visual display. Deception depends on consistency. Real combat units, by necessity, move for combat reasons. When those needs are not synchronized, the illusion may stop being a controlled instrument and become a muddled scene. Operation Brest therefore revealed both the promise and the fragility of the Ghost Army's method. The promise was clear. Visual, sonic, and radio deception could reinforce one another and create a more persuasive impression than any single technique could create alone. The fragility was just as clear. The more complex the illusion, the more it depended on accurate orders, shared understanding among commanders, and disciplined timing. This was the deeper meaning of directing enemy attention. It was not enough to make noise in one place and hope someone listened. It was not enough to inflate tanks in a field and hope someone looked. The false indicators had to answer a question that the enemy might already be asking. Where is the next attack forming? Which unit is holding this sector? Has a division moved, or is it still in place? The Ghost Army's job was to help supply a plausible answer, one useful to Allied plans. Brest also showed that deception could not be separated from the tempo of the larger battle. The fortified port was not waiting politely while specialists arranged their false army. Real infantry, armor, artillery, logistics, and command decisions continued around it. Every hour brought movement and uncertainty. In that environment, the 23rd had to be nimble, but also precise. The operation did not turn the Ghost Army into a flawless machine. It made the unit more aware of what success required. The men had to master their own crafts, but they also had to fit inside the intentions of higher commanders. They had to understand not only what they were faking, but why that fiction mattered to the real fight. From Brest, the 23rd carried forward a sharper appreciation of coordination. Its later operations would continue to combine patches, signs, dummy equipment, recorded sound, spoof radio, and security measures into battlefield illusions. Some missions would cover gaps, some would mask movement, some would rely on radio alone. But the lesson from Brest stayed close. A false army can influence a campaign only when it moves in step with the real one. South of Luxembourg, in September 1944, a quiet stretch of front became dangerous because of what was not there. Patton's Third Army was driving toward Metz, pushing hard into one of the most heavily defended approaches in eastern France. The fight around Metz demanded strength, attention, and movement. As real units were pulled toward that effort, the line elsewhere became thin. For an army in motion, a gap is not just empty ground. It is an invitation to trouble. If the enemy found it, tested it, and forced it at the wrong moment, the momentum of the larger offensive could be threatened. Into that problem came the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. By then, the unit had already learned that deception was not magic. It was engineering, theater, communications, and soldiering compressed into a combat assignment. The 23rd had only about 1,100 men, though its authorized strength was 82 officers and 1,023 enlisted men. Its unusual value lay in the ability to imitate far more than it possessed. With visual deception, sonic deception, spoof radio, and physical and security support, it could suggest the presence of roughly 2 divisions, about 30,000 men, if the story was built carefully enough. Operation Bettemberg, running from September 15 to the 22nd of September 1944, was one of those moments when the story mattered because the real front was exposed. The sector stretched across roughly 20 miles south of Luxembourg. In practical terms, the Ghost Army was asked to make a thin line look stronger than it was, not just occupied, not merely watched. Strong enough to discourage a serious probe, or at least complicate the enemy's picture of what was waiting there. The illusion centered on armored strength. Armor has a particular weight on a battlefield, even before it fires. Tanks suggest mobility, counterattack, reserves, and a commander's willingness to hit back. To imply armor across a weak sector was to change the meaning of that ground. A quiet village road might become a route for tank movement. A field might appear to be an assembly area. A headquarters sign, a shoulder patch, a column of vehicles, and a radio net could all point toward the same conclusion. This part of the line was not empty at all. The men of the 23rd built that conclusion in layers. Inflatable vehicles and dummy positions could give distant observers something to interpret. Real trucks could be marked and moved to create the impression of a larger armored presence. Unit identifiers, if seen by civilians, prisoners, or aerial reconnaissance, had to support the same fiction. Radio operators added another level, transmitting as if the units being impersonated were conducting normal business. Sound crews could help suggest the movement of heavy equipment when conditions allowed. Security personnel helped manage the edges of the performance, because deception fails fastest when the wrong person sees too much at close range. Nothing about this was automatic. A tank made of rubber or canvas is convincing only under certain conditions. Too near, in the wrong light, or for too long, it becomes a liability. A radio operator imitating a larger headquarters has to sound routine, because forced drama can draw attention. A false convoy has to move like a real one, not like a parade staged for an audience. Even the small details had to agree with one another. The strength implied by the radios had to match the activity suggested on the roads. The headquarters signs had to fit the units being simulated. The vehicles had to appear where an armored force might plausibly put them. The danger in Bettemberg was duration. A short deception can sometimes rely on surprise. A longer one has to survive repetition. For more than a week, the Ghost Army had to hold the enemy's attention on a fiction across that 20-mile sector while real operations continued elsewhere. Each day increased the chance that weather, movement, local contact, or simple bad luck might reveal a seam. A patrol could get too close. A civilian might carry a detail that did not fit. A reconnaissance flight might see too little activity in the wrong place. A radio pattern might betray that the large formation was smaller than it claimed. And behind the illusion stood real men, not stagehands outside the war. The 23rd worked close enough to the front that discovery could have brought artillery, patrols, or attack onto positions that were never meant to fight like the formations they represented. Across its war in Europe, 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed and dozens wounded. That reality belongs inside any account of its deceptions. The work used artifice, but it took place in range of real weapons. Beddenberg showed the maturity of the Ghost Army after the early lessons of Brest. This was not a single trick set down in a field. It was a sustained answer to an operational problem. Patton's army needed strength in one place while it fought hard in another. The 23rd supplied the appearance of that strength, stretching a small body of specialists into the outline of a much larger armored force. For more than a week, the empty line was made to look occupied by power it did not actually have. The success of the mission cannot be measured in dramatic claims that the evidence does not support. What can be said is narrower and still remarkable. During Operation Beddenberg, the Ghost Army covered a dangerous gap in Third Army's line while the campaign pressed forward. But autumn was turning. The war in the West was not settling into a clean sequence of planned performances. Roads worsened, weather closed in, and the front grew unstable. Soon the Ghost Army would have to adapt again, not by building a full illusion of tanks and camps, but by using radio alone when the battlefield made a broader performance impossible. By late 1944, the roads of Western Europe had become a test of endurance as much as movement. The campaign that had burst out of Normandy was now pressing through distance, weather, supply strain, and hardening resistance. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops moved with that changing war. Its men had been trained to create signs of formations larger than themselves, but every operation depended on conditions. A deception built on inflatable equipment needed space, concealment, and visibility control just enough to be useful. Sonic deception needed the right terrain and a reason for the enemy to believe what he heard. Radio deception needed discipline, timing, and a story that made sense inside the known movements of Allied units. As the front shifted, the Ghost Army's toolkit had to be flexible. The unit's four main capabilities remained visual deception, sonic deception, spoof radio, and physical and security support. In theory, these could be combined into a full battlefield performance, the kind that suggested camps, headquarters, traffic, engines, and entire units where only a fraction of that strength existed. In practice, war often removed pieces from the board. Snow, fog, mud, rapid movement, enemy pressure, and broken schedules could make a carefully staged visual display impossible or unwise. Then came the German offensive through the Ardennes, the battle remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. The fighting created confusion across a wide front. Units were moving under pressure. Lines of communication were strained. Bastogne became a critical point in the battle, held under desperate conditions while Allied forces worked to relieve it. In that environment, the Ghost Army received a different kind of assignment, Operation Kodak. Kodak was radio only. That detail matters because it strips the deception down to one of its most technical forms. No broad display of dummy tanks defines this mission. No full arrangement of visual, sonic, and radio effects working together in the usual layered fashion. Instead, the operation depended on the invisible architecture of signals. Operators had to create radio traffic that suggested the presence or movement of units in a way that fit the larger Allied plan. The purpose was to divert attention from the effort to relieve Bastogne. Radio deception worked because armies listened. In modern war, a unit's presence was not only a matter of what could be seen on a road or in a field, it was also carried by call signs, message volume, transmission habits, and the routine rhythms of command. A headquarters that appears to speak like a headquarters can become part of the enemy's map. A unit that seems to report, request, coordinate, and move over the air may begin to occupy mental space even before anyone sees it. But a radio-only deception was also fragile in its own way. It could not lean on the sight of vehicles or the rumble of recorded armor to reinforce the story. The airwaves had to carry more of the burden. The traffic had to be plausible without becoming theatrical. Too little activity, and the fiction might not register. Too much, and it might look manufactured. The operators had to fit their work into the known language of military communications while avoiding the kind of pattern that would reveal a small team pretending to be something larger. Operation Kodak showed the Ghost Army adapting to a battlefield where a full performance was not always possible. Winter conditions and the speed of events limited what deception could safely or effectively display. So the unit used the part of its craft that could travel without a visible stage. Signals could suggest movement beyond the horizon. They could imply priorities, headquarters, and formations without asking a dummy tank to survive snow, darkness, and close scrutiny. It is important not to overstate what any one deception did in a battle as large and violent as the Bulge. The relief of Bastogne involved real troops, real armor, real artillery, and costly combat. Operation Kodak did not replace that effort. It supported the broader struggle by presenting a misleading radio picture, intended to draw attention away from where the relief effort was developing. Its contribution was measured in uncertainty imposed on the enemy's understanding, not in a clean, simple claim that one signal trick changed the battle. For the men of the 23rd, this was another reminder that their weapon was not a single device. It was adaptation. Sometimes they inflated tanks, sometimes they moved trucks under false markings, sometimes they played recorded engines through powerful speakers. Sometimes they created the chatter of a formation that existed only as carefully managed transmissions. The battlefield decided which tools could be used. The winter campaign did not end the Ghost Army's work. As 1945 approached, the Allied armies were pushing toward Germany itself. The Rhine stood ahead, not merely as a river, but as a military barrier with enormous symbolic and practical weight. Crossing it would require planning, concentration, and secrecy. And for one of the 23rd's largest late-war deceptions, the performance would again become broad, physical, noisy, and carefully arranged. The next stage would not be a thin winter signal in the air. It would be a false gathering before one of the final great obstacles in the West. In March 1945, the Rhine waited ahead of the Ninth Army like a line drawn across the final map of the war in the West. A river crossing under combat conditions is one of the most demanding operations an army can attempt. Troops, engineers, vehicles, artillery, supplies, command posts, and traffic control all have to converge without advertising too clearly where the blow will fall. The enemy does not need to know everything to cause damage. A reasonable guess can be enough to shift fire, move reserves, or strengthen the wrong bank at the right time. So as the Ninth Army prepared for its real crossing of the Rhine, deception again became part of the plan. Operation Viersen ran from March 18 to the 24th of March 1945. The mission for the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was to simulate the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions away from the 9th Army's actual crossing area. The idea was not simply to make noise somewhere else. It was to create the appearance of divisional presence and preparation in the wrong place, giving the enemy a plausible picture that did not match the real one. By this point in the war, the Ghost Army had developed a practiced method for building such a picture. The 23rd had conducted large-scale deceptions across Europe from Normandy toward the Rhine, part of a total of 22 operations. Its men understood that an army is recognized by accumulation. A division is not just a patch or a radio call sign or a few trucks parked under trees. It is headquarters activity, supply movement, traffic, signs, security behavior, engine sounds, and the daily clutter of military life. To imitate divisions, the Ghost Army had to imitate the pattern of divisions. The false assembly areas were central to the performance. An army preparing to cross a major river would gather men and equipment with purpose. That meant the deception had to suggest concentration without exposing its emptiness. Dummy equipment could help shape the visual story from a distance. Vehicles could be arranged or moved to imply traffic greater than the 23rd actually possessed. Signs and markings could guide observers toward the identity of the supposed units. Headquarters locations had to fit the fiction, appearing active enough to be believed but controlled enough to avoid close inspection. Supply activity mattered as well. Divisions consume. They require fuel, ammunition, rations, maintenance, medical support, and communications. A false division that shows only fighting vehicles can look suspicious, because real units drag long logistical shadows behind them. The Ghost Army's physical and security elements help create and protect those shadows. They could set out the visible hints of supply work and manage access to areas where the performance was not meant to be examined too closely. The goal was not perfection at arm's length. It was credibility at the distances and through the channels by which the enemy was likely to observe. Sound added another dimension. Sonic deception could project the impression of vehicle movement and heavy activity when conditions made that useful. Recorded sounds of military movement, amplified and placed carefully, could suggest columns in motion or units assembling. But sound had to match the story. A noise that did not correspond to visible traffic or expected timing might invite suspicion. In Viersen, as in the 23rd's best operations, the elements had to support one another. What the eye might see, what the ear might hear, and what the radio might report all had to point in the same general direction. The radio story was equally important. Spoof radio operators could impersonate the communications patterns of larger formations. For Viersen, those transmissions helped sustain the impression that the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were associated with the false area rather than the actual crossing preparations. This required more than sending messages. It required a rhythm of military life over the air, enough to make the false headquarters and subordinate units seem present, functioning, and connected. There was always risk in such a large deception. The closer the real crossing came, the more sensitive the timing became. A false assembly built too early might grow stale. One built too late might not influence anyone's picture. Too much activity could look staged. Too little could be ignored. The Ghost Army had to occupy that narrow middle ground, presenting enough evidence to be noticed and believed without giving the enemy a loose thread to pull. And again, the men doing it were soldiers inside a live battle zone. The approach to the Rhine was not a theatrical backdrop. Artillery, patrols, air observation, and sudden movement remained part of the world around them. The 23rd's illusions were designed to mislead, but the danger around those illusions was real. Their record across the European campaign included killed and wounded men, a reminder that deception in war does not happen outside the reach of war. Operation Viersen became the last great performance of the Ghost Army's combat role. From March 18 to 24, the unit simulated the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions away from the 9th Army's true Rhine crossing area, contributing to a broader plan built on concealment, timing, and force. It represented the mature form of what the 23rd had been created to do after its activation on the 20th of January 1944. Use a small, specialized force to suggest the presence of something vastly larger. After the Rhine, the war in Europe moved toward its final collapse. The Ghost Army's combat deceptions would soon give way to different duties, including the difficult work some members performed after the fighting, helping manage displaced person camps that held up to 100,000 people. For decades, much of what they had done remained hidden under classification, before official details emerged in the mid-1990s. Long after the inflatable tanks were packed away and the radios fell silent, the scale of the deception would finally come into public view. In the third week of March 1945, the Rhine was more than a river on a map. It was a barrier, a military deadline, and one of the last great defensive lines between the Western Allies and the interior of Germany. Along its approaches, the Ninth Army prepared for a real crossing, while a smaller force prepared to make another crossing seem possible somewhere else. From March 18 to March 24, Operation Viersen became the Ghost Army's final major combat deception. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was assigned to simulate the presence of the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions away from the 9th Army's true crossing area. The idea was not to win the Rhine by magic. It was to help shape what the enemy saw, heard, and intercepted during a moment when German commanders had to judge where the blow would fall. By this point, the 23rd had refined its work into a system. Its strength was never a single fake tank or a single clever radio message. The unit's four principal tools were visual deception, sonic deception, spoof radio, and physical and security support. At Viersen, those tools were brought together at scale. Hundreds of decoys helped create the visible footprint of a much larger force. Inflatable vehicles, carefully placed equipment, and the movement patterns around them suggested units gathering for action. From the air or at a distance, the scene could look convincing if it matched the other evidence around it. At night, the sound element added weight to the picture. Repeated sound programs projected the noises of armored and infantry units in motion, the kinds of mechanical rhythms and activity that could imply an army preparing to move. The effect depended on timing, terrain, and restraint. Too little sound would mean nothing. Too much could call attention to itself. The 23rd sonic deception was not a random barrage of noise. It was meant to support a story already being told by the decoys on the ground and by the traffic moving through the airwaves. That radio traffic was its own battlefield. Spoof radio operators imitated the communications patterns of real formations, creating the impression that the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were where the deception plan needed them to be. In modern terms, they were building a false network presence. In wartime terms, they were creating a pattern intended for enemy intercepts, headquarters, subordinate units, routine signals, and the kind of disciplined chatter that could make an imagined concentration seem alive. The danger was that every layer had to agree. If the radio suggested one thing, the visual display another, and local movement a third, the illusion could start to fray. Operation Brest, months earlier, had shown the risks when visual, sonic, and radio deception were combined for the first time. The 23rd had learned that a large deception was not just a performance, it was coordination under pressure. At Viersen, the unit was operating with the experience of many missions behind it, but experience did not remove the danger of error. The broader Allied plan relied on concealment and timing. As the real assault formed elsewhere, the false picture near Viersen was designed to give German attention another possible focus. The result should be understood with care. No deception operation can be credited as the single cause of success in a campaign as large as the Rhine crossing. The real operation involved massed forces, planning, engineering, logistics, air power, and command decisions far beyond the 23rd's small formation. Still, the 23rd's contribution mattered enough to be recognized. General William Simpson, commander of the 9th Army, commended the unit's work after Operation Viersen. That commendation did not mean an army had crossed a continent because of inflatable armor and sound recordings alone. It meant that, at a critical point, a specialized unit of roughly 1,100 men had helped create a believable false order of battle, one that supported the larger military design. For the men on the ground, the success of Viersen lay in the discipline of making the unreal look ordinary. A fake concentration had to appear not as a spectacle, but as the routine presence of large units preparing for war. Trucks had to seem to belong. Signals had to sound like procedure. Decoys had to occupy plausible ground. Noise had to rise and fade in ways that suggested movement rather than performance. Security troops and physical support had to protect the fiction from casual exposure. In that sense, Viersen showed the mature form of the Ghost Army's method. The 23rd had been activated on the 20th of January, 1944. With an authorized strength of 82 officers and 1,023 enlisted men, it could simulate roughly 2 divisions, around 30,000 men, with only about 1,100 personnel. Across Europe, from Normandy to the Rhine, it conducted 22 large-scale deceptions. By March 1945, the unit had become a compact machine for manufacturing military reality, a way to make absence look like mass. And then, as the Rhine crossing unfolded and the war in Europe moved toward its final weeks, the Great Deception at Viersen marked a turning point. The 23rd's combat role was nearing its end. The men who had built armies out of air, sound, canvas, radio discipline, and controlled movement would soon face a different aftermath of war, one that could not be inflated, hidden, or switched off at night. A deception site near the front could look strangely harmless from a distance. A tank might be light enough to lift, a gun might be only a shape, a division might exist mostly in radio traffic, tire tracks, and night noise. But the shells were real, the patrols were real, and the men assigned to the illusion were still soldiers in a combat zone. The Ghost Army's work was sometimes remembered for its ingenuity, and for good reason. It used artists, radio operators, sound technicians, engineers, drivers, and security personnel in ways that did not fit the usual image of frontline fighting. Yet it was not a bloodless assignment. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed, and dozens were wounded. Those numbers matter because they correct the temptation to treat the unit's war as a clever prank carried out at a safe distance. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops operated close enough to danger for danger to reach it. Its very mission could increase that exposure. The unit often had to appear larger and more important than it was. It could simulate roughly 2 divisions, around 30,000 men, while having only about 1,100 personnel. That meant a small formation might draw attention meant for a much larger one. The work depended on being noticed, but not understood. It asked the men to create evidence strong enough to interest enemy observers, while avoiding mistakes that would reveal how thin the deception really was. They did this without the heavy combat power of the formations they pretended to be. The 23rd had physical and security support as one of its 4 main capabilities, but it was not an armored division. It was not built to fight like the units it imitated. Its protection was limited compared with the apparent weight it projected. If artillery found a deception area, if a patrol came too close, or if a position became exposed during shifting operations, the men there could not rely on the kind of mass their decoys suggested. That contradiction sat at the center of their service. They made themselves look big while remaining vulnerable. They suggested depth while operating with a comparatively small number of personnel. They helped conceal real movements by becoming a visible alternative. In the European campaign, where the 23rd conducted 22 large-scale deceptions from Normandy to the Rhine, that meant repeated movement into operational spaces where the front was not an abstraction. Roads were congested, positions changed. The weather could expose equipment or complicate movement. Enemy fire and observation remained part of the landscape. There was also the pressure of precision. A conventional unit could sometimes reveal its presence simply by existing. The Ghost Army had to reveal a carefully selected version of its presence. The wrong vehicle in the wrong place, a careless radio pattern, an unrealistic sound program, or a gap between the visual and radio story could put the mission at risk. The danger was not only physical, it was professional and tactical. Their work had to be convincing enough to affect enemy estimates without becoming so theatrical that it invited scrutiny. When the combat deceptions ended, the war did not immediately become simple for the men of the unit. After their battlefield mission, members helped manage displaced person camps that held up to 100,000 people. This was a different kind of duty from building false armies, but it belonged to the same devastated European landscape. The collapse of Nazi Germany left vast numbers of people uprooted, displaced, and dependent on military administration. For some members of the Ghost Army, the final work overseas involved not deception, but management, order, and the difficult human aftermath of war. That post-combat service broadens the picture of who these men were. They were not only specialists in trickery, they were soldiers carried from one form of wartime responsibility into another. The skills that had helped them coordinate elaborate deception operations did not erase what they encountered after the fighting. Inflatable tanks and recorded movement belonged to one phase of the campaign. Displaced person camps belonged to the aftermath, where the costs of the war appeared not as tactical problems, but as human reality on a massive scale. The cost behind the trick, then, was not only the risk of being killed or wounded, though that risk was real and paid by members of the unit. It was also the strain of operating in the uncertain space between visibility and concealment, between appearing powerful and being exposed, between making a battlefield fiction and living inside an actual battlefield. Their success depended on illusion, but their service did not. By the time the men began returning home, much of what they had done could not be publicly explained. The missions, the methods, and the full shape of the unit's contribution remained locked away. The army they had invented had vanished by design. Soon the real army that invented it would also disappear from public memory, hidden not by camouflage nets or spoof radio, but by secrecy. After the war, a man could come home with a uniform, a few habits he did not explain, and a record that left out some of the strangest work he had ever done. For members of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the return to civilian life came with an unusual silence. They had helped create an army that never existed, and then the story of that army largely disappeared. The secrecy was not incidental. The Ghost Army's methods remained classified for decades. Its missions depended on techniques the military did not want publicly unpacked: visual deception, sonic deception, spoof radio, and the physical and security practices that made the false picture believable. The men had carried out 22 large-scale deceptions in Europe, from Normandy to the Rhine, but for years that record could not be fully told in public. Careers resumed, families grew. Artists, designers, radio men, and other veterans went back into ordinary American life without the broad public credit that often attaches to dramatic wartime service. That silence shaped the memory of the unit. Traditional battle narratives tend to favor visible force. tanks advancing, infantry attacking, aircraft overhead, commanders issuing orders across maps. The Ghost Army worked in a different register. Its victories, when they came, were measured in confusion, encouraged, attention redirected, and false assumptions made plausible. Those are difficult things to display on a memorial wall or in a hometown newspaper. A fake division leaves no battlefield monument of its own. For decades, the larger public had only fragments. Some veterans knew what they had done, and some families heard pieces, but the official details remained restricted. The story did not vanish because it lacked drama. It vanished because its drama had been built around concealment, and concealment outlived the war. The same discipline that protected operations in Europe also delayed recognition afterward. That began to change in the mid-1990s, when official details were declassified. Declassification did not instantly make the Ghost Army famous, but it opened the door. Historians, families, filmmakers, museums, and surviving veterans could begin reconstructing the unit's record with greater clarity. The strange outlines became sharper. A unit activated on the 20th of January 1944 with an authorized strength of 82 officers and 1,023 enlisted men. A formation of about 1,100 personnel that could simulate roughly 2 divisions, around 30,000 men. A campaign of deception that stretched from Normandy to the Rhine. With time, the story gained public form. Operation Brest could be understood as the first mission that combined visual, sonic, and radio deception, and also as a warning about coordination risks. Operation Bedenburg could be seen as the effort that covered a dangerous gap in Patton's line from September 15 to 22, 1944. Operation Kodak during the Battle of the Bulge could be recognized as a radio-only deception that diverted attention from the effort to relieve Bastogne. Operation Viersen could stand as the mature final performance, simulating the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions away from the 9th Army's actual Rhine crossing area. The recovery of the story also restored the seriousness of the service. The Ghost Army was easy to describe in colorful terms, with inflatable tanks, loudspeakers, and false radio networks. But the deeper truth was more demanding. 3 soldiers were killed, dozens were wounded. The men operated near front lines with limited heavy weapons compared with the formations they imitated. Some later helped manage displaced person camps, holding up to 100,000 people. The comic surface of some tools should never be mistaken for a comic war. Recognition came slowly and then formally. In March 2024, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and the 3,133rd Signal Service Company Special received the Congressional Gold Medal. By then, the war they had fought was nearly 8 decades in the past. The honor arrived long after the decoys had been packed away, long after most wartime secrecy had lost its operational purpose, and long after many veterans had spent their lives without wide public acknowledgement. The medal did not change what happened in Europe. It could not restore the dead, erase wounds, or return the long years of silence. But it marked a national admission that deception, when disciplined and integrated, had been a real contribution to the Allied war effort. It recognized not just cleverness, but service under risk. The final lesson of the Ghost Army is not that a rubber tank can fool an enemy by itself. It cannot. A prop alone is only a prop. Credible deception is a complete system. It needs visual evidence that fits the ground, sound that fits the hour, radio traffic that fits the supposed unit, movement that fits the story, and security strong enough to protect the seams. It depends on people who understand that the lie must be organized like truth. That was the achievement of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. With about 1,100 men, it suggested the weight of tens of thousands. It turned absence into presence and performance into military evidence. Then for decades, it disappeared almost as completely as the armies it had invented. When the story finally came back into view, what emerged was not a battlefield trick, but a study in disciplined imagination under fire.